In a courtroom thick with silence and secrets, Princess Anne did the unimaginable. She broke, and with one trembling statement, she shattered the royal code. The air inside the royal courtroom was heavy, almost suffocating. Every breath, every glance, every movement was muted by the gravity of what was unfolding. Royal aides stood stiff. Legal teams whispered cautiously. The press gallery sat frozen, eyes wide, pens halted. No one had expected this, not from her. Princess Anne, known for her stoicism, her discipline, her relentless service to the crown, had just walked to the witness stand, not as a royal, but as a woman carrying the weight of generations. Her composure was unmistakably firm at first, but it was betrayed by a single detail that trembled in her hands. As she faced the court, her gaze passed over her brother, King Charles III. Seated a few rows away, he looked back with a guarded expression. And then Anne opened her mouth, and the monarchy as the world knew it shifted. I remember something my mother once told me. She began. The words were barely above a whisper, but the room was instantly still. The crown must pass through William, not just by birth, but by heart. A pause, a tear, and then silence. Gasps were muffled. No one moved. Charles, the sovereign, once shielded by a lifetime of royal restraint, quietly reached for his face. A single tear escaped, caught by the flash of a camera he had failed to avoid. The king had cried, and the press had seen it. For the first time, a monarch had been emotionally cornered in public, not by critics, not by protesters, but by his own sister. Anne didn't wait for a response. She stepped down. Not to applause, not to rejection, but to a reverberating shockwave that pulsed through the room like an aftershock. This wasn't just a crack in royal protocol, it was an earthquake. The press later described it as the moment the monarchy exhaled. But it was more than that. Anne's words carried the weight of her mother's unspoken fears, her sister-in-law's broken dreams, and the quiet strength of a man the Queen believed should someday lead. A sentence became a revelation, a tear became a symbol, and a silence became a reckoning. Observers didn't miss the deeper message. This wasn't simply about emotion. It was about succession, about legacy, about a future the Queen may have, being coming but never voiced until now through her daughter. The palace, so used to controlling the narrative, could do nothing but watch as the floodgates opened. And as Anne sat back down, the silence in the room wasn't empty. It was loaded with meaning, memories, and the undeniable sense that everything had changed. A new royal chapter had begun, not with ceremony, but with confession. What led to this seismic courtroom moment? The answer lies buried in documents sealed by a queen who saw the future differently than anyone expected. Locked away for decades, Queen Elizabeth's handwritten letters now threatened to rewrite the very order of the royal line. What began as a formal review of estate protocols quickly escalated into something far more consequential. During the courtroom session that gripped the nation, it wasn't just Princess Anne's trembling voice or King Charles's silent tears that stirred the headlines. It was the unexpected unsealing of a vault, figuratively and literally, of the Queen's most closely guarded reflections. Among the legal exhibits lay a collection of handwritten letters, fragile in form but explosive in content. These were not state papers or ceremonial briefings. They were personal, raw, untouched by royal filters. In palace walls, they were whispered about as the Windsor Letters, a name spoken quietly but always with reverence. And now the public knows why. The letters penned by Queen Elizabeth over the course of many private years revealed a side of the monarch few had ever seen. They weren't written for the world, nor even for the press-hardened historians of the crown. They were for her children, her inner circle, and most chillingly for the future. Inside these letters were not only reflections on duty and destiny, but subtle clues about the Queen's vision for the monarchy's next chapter. Hidden among memories of state visits and family holidays were passages that hinted at discomfort, even unease over the conventional line of succession. The Queen, it seemed, had quietly questioned whether tradition alone should guide the crown's path. One letter in particular set the courtroom murmuring a note written in the Queen's unmistakable script where she mused, "Leadership is more than inheritance. It is a responsibility, worn with grace." While she never explicitly named who should wear the crown, the implication was unmistakable. Other writings leaned into admiration for William's calm demeanor, his bond with the public, his approachability. She spoke of him as someone who listens more than he speaks, someone who understands the weight of power without needing to show it. These were not idle compliments. In the context of a legal discussion about estate impact and constitutional roles, they were seismic shifts in tone from a monarch known for her neutral, guarded language. The legal tension exploded behind closed doors. Lawyers argued over whether the Queen's private sentiments should influence constitutional duties. Could personal letters, unearthed decades later, tilt the delicate balance between public governance and private conscience? Technically, they were irrelevant to parliamentary law. Emotionally, they were nuclear. The public wanted answers. The press demanded context. And in the middle of it all stood Princess Anne, the Queen's most dutiful child, who now bore the weight of carrying these revelations forward. Anne did not flinch. Her words in court were clear, unwavering. The public has a right to know what the monarchy truly stands for. At that moment, she wasn't just a royal, she was a messenger. She had seen the letters. She had felt the Queen's struggle, written in ink. And now she was delivering a truth the monarchy could no longer suppress. Her insistence shocked even her closest allies. Anne, who for decades had stood behind royal walls without ever breaking formation, had chosen to speak for the truth instead of the institution. And among all the revelations, one haunting line from Anne turned whispers into undeniable thunder. 6 words changed everything. Spoken softly, but they landed like thunder across the royal courtroom. Anne stood still as the echo of her own voice seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. The sentence was simple, but the silence it left behind was not. The crown must pass through William, not just by birth, but by heart. Those words weren't policy. They weren't part of a legal argument. They were something more powerful, personal truth, sharpened by memory, loaded with legacy. And in that single moment, Anne didn't just shake the courtroom, she cracked open the monarchy's most carefully guarded future. The words hadn't come from her. Not truly. They had come from Queen Elizabeth II herself during a walk that now felt like a lifetime ago. Anne had been at Balmoral, the Queen's most sacred retreat, where the world felt far away and the family could finally exhale. There among the rolling hills and quiet lochs, mother and daughter had shared a rare moment of honesty. The Queen, typically reserved, had let down her royal mask. Age had softened her, but it had also filled her with worry. And it was there, on that quiet path beneath the grey skies of Scotland, that she confided in Anne not as monarch to subject, but as mother to daughter. She had spoken of the future, of the weight of the crown, and of William. "It must pass through him," she said. Her voice assures the wind around them. Not just because of birthright, because of heart. Anne never forgot it. Not the way she said it, not the pause before the word heart, and certainly not the look in her mother's eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much and said, too little for too long. When Anne repeated those words in court, it wasn't an accident. It was a calculated risk, a deliberate challenge. Because Charles was sitting just a few feet away, frozen in his seat. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. But he felt it. Everyone did. It wasn't a rejection, but a redirect. A quiet message that the Queen, even in her silence, had been thinking beyond the crown's traditions. Thinking about who could carry the weight, not just wear the jewels. The words didn't only strike Charles, they struck the world. For decades, the monarchy had been defined by bloodlines and birth orders. But now, here was the Queen's daughter voicing a deeper, more human, test heart. And while it may have surprised many, it echoed something that had once been whispered in other circles by another royal gone too soon. Because what Anne had said wasn't just the Queen's belief, it was also Diana's dream. A future where the monarchy was defined not by titles, but by compassion. Diana had hoped her son would lead differently, live differently, love differently. And in this moment, through Anne, it felt as though both the Queen and Diana had spoken in unison, one through memory, the other through legacy. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than words ever could. For the first time, the public saw the monarchy through a different lens. Not just lineage, but love. Not just duty, but empathy. And standing at the heart of that shift was William. But Anne wasn't speaking just for herself, or even her mother. He was also honoring a silent friendship, long misunderstood. They were painted as opposites. But behind palace walls, Princess Diana and Anne found common ground in quiet rebellion. To the public, they were day and night. Diana, the glamorous, emotional media magnet. Anne, the no-nonsense, tight-lipped pillar of tradition. Tabloids crafted stories of rivalry, contrasting their every move, fashion choice, and facial expression. The press painted Anne as cold, resentful of Diana's popularity. Diana, in turn, was portrayed as too modern, too unpredictable for Anne's rigid royal worldview. But like most royal myths, the truth was far more complicated and far more intimate. Beneath the frosted formalities and public smiles, there was a bond. Not loud, not performative, but forged in something far deeper than protocol. It was born in survival. The few saw where the late-night phone calls when the palace lights were low and the cameras were gone. The quiet walks through Windsor's gardens, away from watchful eyes. The short but meaningful notes Anne would leave, or Diana, were never emotional on the surface. But carrying messages of solidarity only another woman bound by royal duty could understand. They both knew what it meant to be misunderstood. They both knew how it felt to be trapped in a system that demanded silence, even as it crushed them from within. When Diana's marriage to Charles began to unravel, the world watched the drama unfold in headlines. But Anne didn't join the chorus. She didn't speak publicly, didn't offer grand gestures. Instead, she did something far more telling than she listened. In private, she offered advice, support, and when necessary, the kind of hard truth only a sister-in-law could deliver. There were reports, later confirmed by palace insiders, that Anne was one of the few who refused to judge Diana during the breakdown of her marriage. And when the pressure became unbearable, when Diana found herself more alone than ever, it was Anne who stood beside her, not in front of cameras, but in the quiet halls of Windsor, behind closed doors, where true loyalty isn't seen, only felt. After Diana's death, Anne never gave a statement that drew headlines. But at the private funeral service, she wore a bracelet, a modest silver band that Diana had once gifted her. She wore it beneath her sleeve, where cameras wouldn't catch it, but where her heart knew it was there. A silent tribute, a whispered farewell. And years later, in that courtroom, when Anne echoed the Queen's hope that William would lead with empathy, not just entitlement, those who remembered that quiet bond heard another voice in her words. Diana's. Anne's statement was, more than a message, it was vindication for Diana, who had once dared to suggest that the monarchy needed more heart, for a future where titles meant less and humanity meant more. Anne hadn't just confirmed the Queen's faith in William, she had honored Diana's dream for her son, a dream that the crown could evolve, soften, and serve rather than command. That moment in court wasn't just for the monarchy. It was for Diana, for everything she endured, and everything she never got to finish. But her alliance with Diana wasn't without cost, especially in her lifelong complicated relationship with her brother, raised in the same palace, but destined for different paths. Anne and Charles were never truly close. From the outside, they were the perfect royal siblings, the dutiful daughter and the future king. But behind the castle walls, beneath the perfect portraits and choreographed appearances, a quiet divide grew. Not out of scandal, not even out of rivalry, but out of something colder: emotional distance. Charles, the sensitive heir, sought meaning in poetry, in causes, in philosophy. He questioned tradition, pushed boundaries, and often let his emotions guide him, sometimes to his own detriment. Children, by contrast, armored herself with silence. She didn't ask questions, she showed up, got the job done, and disappeared before the press could ask her name. She was the embodiment of royal discipline. He was the dreamer, born into duty. As children, they shared the same nannies, the same palace rooms, the same rigid schedules. But even then, they were emotionally miles apart. Charles turned inward, often escaping into books and classical music. Anne turned forward, her eyes always fixed on the next task, the next obligation. They rarely played together, rarely laughed together. The weight of expectation didn't just fall on Charles as heir, it landed on Anne too. Only hers came without the fanfare. Her loyalty was assumed, never celebrated. Her strength was expected, never praised. And then came Camilla. Her presence didn't just alter the public's view of Charles, it widened the gap between brother and sister. While Charles found comfort in Camilla's warmth and understanding, Anne stood on the outside watching, not with resentment, but with quiet judgment. To her, Camilla represented a departure from duty, a choice driven by emotion over obligation. Anne never said much. She didn't need to. Her silence around Camilla was more cutting than any words. For years, Queen Elizabeth worked tirelessly to hold them together. She was the buffer, the glue, the silent referee in a game of unspoken grievances. When Charles and Anne drifted too far, she'd call them in for tea, for quiet moments that felt ordinary, but were loaded with purpose. She reminded them of the institution, of the crown, of the legacy, and for decades they held the line. But when the Queen died, that final tether broke. In the courtroom, Anne's words weren't loud, but they were precise. They were devastating, and they were aimed directly at her brother's heart. The crown must pass through William, not just by birth, but by heart. That wasn't just a memory. It was a reckoning. It was everything she had never said, finally set free. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent walking beside her brother, but never with him. For Charles, it was more than a public humiliation. It was a confirmation of something he had always feared, but never faced, that even within his own family, doubt surrounded his reign. And for Anne, it wasn't revenge, it wasn't bitter, it was duty, pure and simple, just like everything else she had done her entire life. But this time, her duty wasn't to the institution, it was to the truth. And just when the world thought Anne had nothing more to say, she dropped one final revelation about the woman the Queen truly trusted. She dire is the future. Queen Elizabeth's quiet belief in Catherine just changed the entire royal equation. Until that moment, Catherine had always been seen through a familiar lens. Elegant, composed, dutiful. The perfect partner to William, a picture of grace in pearls and silence. But in court, Anne shattered that limited frame. Her voice didn't rise, but her words did. "My mother saw something special in Catherine," she said calmly, "something enduring." The room stilled. Everyone leaned in, not because of Anne's tone, but because of the weight behind it. This wasn't royal courtesy. This was a queen's hidden truth finally unveiled. and it came from the lips of the one woman who had never strayed from service. The Queen, it turns out, hadn't just admired Catherine. She had trusted her. In private, she had confided in Anne, using words no one expected to hear from the monarch so known for restraint. "Catherine is not just dignified," she had said. "She is steady. She is the future." That statement, long buried in royal confidence, was now public record, and in that single sentence, the entire perception of Catherine shifted from accessory to anchor. From supporting role to cornerstone to Anne, this wasn't a revelation for drama's sake. It was a strategy. It was a success. It was a legacy. And the court heard it loud and clear. But the person who heard it loudest, who felt it deepest, was Charles. He shifted just feet away. He turned toward Camilla. And for the second time that day, his voice cracked. "She never told me that. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disbelief. It was something far more vulnerable. Regret. Regret that a mother could share such defining words with one child, but not another. That she had looked beyond him, beyond tradition, and seen Catherine as the true continuation of her reign. For Charles, it wasn't merely a matter of being passed over. It was the realization that his mother had prepared a different path for the crown. A path that didn't start with him, but with the generation after him. A monarchy not simply carried by duty, but powered by connection. Catherine's rise had been gradual, quiet, unassumed. And yet here in this courtroom, it surged forward like a tidal wave no one could stop. The public had long loved Catherine, but now they began to see her differently. She wasn't just the elegant Princess of Wales. She wasn't just William's wife. She was the bridge between old and new, between a monarchy ruled by expectation and one shaped by empathy. Anne's statement wasn't flattery. It was a transfer of trust. And in the Queen's absence, that trust became everything. Because once that belief is spoken, it can't be undone. The torch had been passed not in a grand ceremony, but in a simple recollection. And the fire it lit would burn through everything the monarchy thought it understood about its future. For Charles, this wasn't just testimony. It was heartbreak, and his reaction said everything. He had waited a lifetime to wear the crown. But now, sitting on the throne, the tears came. For decades, Charles had been the man waiting, the longest-serving heir in British history, the prince who lived in the shadows of his mother's reign. Always watching, always preparing, always wondering when his time would finally come. But nothing, not the speeches, the ceremonies, the countless engagements had prepared him for this. Not for the moment his sister stood in open court and revealed that the Queen, their mother, had confided her deepest hopes in someone else. And not just someone else, but Catherine. As Anne's words echoed across the courtroom, steady, enduring, the future Charles's world didn't collapse. It simply cracked. His composure, carefully practiced over a lifetime, slipped. He turned to Camilla, his voice barely a breath. "She never told me that." A single sentence that said everything. He wasn't angry. He was undone. Because at that moment, he wasn't the king. He was a son who had spent his entire life trying to live up to a standard that it now seemed he had never truly met. The tears came slowly. Not dramatic, not loud, but they came. The man who had weathered decades of public scrutiny, who had buried two parents under the unforgiving eyes of the world, now sat exposed, emotionally raw for the very first time. The courtroom didn't erupt, but the shift in energy was unmistakable. The press didn't need words. The image of a monarch crying said more than any headline could. It wasn't just about Catherine. It was about everything that had gone unsaid between a mother and her eldest son. The unspoken expectations, the distance masked as duty, the love expressed through formality, never feeling. Charles had lived his entire life carrying the idea of the crown like a sacred burden, but now that he wore it, it felt impossibly heavy, especially under the weight of doubt. Camilla sat beside him, frozen in place, her face unreadable, her body rigid. To some, she looked shocked. To others, simply resigned, because she too understood what was happening. This wasn't just a family reckoning. This was the fracture of something the public wasn't supposed to see. For years, the monarchy projected strength. Now it revealed sorrow. Charles didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His silence, his tears, his whispered regret, these were the signs of a man realizing that he may have inherited the crown, but not the confidence that once supported it. But in that courtroom, amid legal documents and royal truths, the king looked less like a ruler and more like a boy, finally understanding that some battles were lost long before they ever began. To understand the weight Anne carries and why she finally cracked, we must go back to where it all began. Before she became the unbreakable royal, Anne was just a girl raised in a palace where duty came before love. From the very beginning, Princess Anne's life was never her own. At just 18 months old, her world changed overnight when her mother ascended the throne. Childhood, as most would know it, ended then. There were no lazy mornings or unscheduled afternoons. There were protocols, procedures, and expectations wrapped in layers of silence. While other children were hugged and comforted, Anne was trained to wave, to walk a certain way, to never cry, to never falter. The crown cast a long shadow, and Anne grew up beneath it, molded not by affection, but by responsibility. Unlike Charles, who was encouraged to ponder and express, Anne was expected to endure. She became fiercely independent, not out of rebellion, but out of survival. There was no room for weakness. Every emotion was measured, every word filtered. Even in her earliest years, she understood what was demanded of her. Applause didn't matter. Approval was earned only through obedience. And so she didn't complain. She didn't question. She absorbed the weight and let it forge her identity. By the time she was a teenager, Anne had become the very image of composure, quiet, resilient, and relentless in her commitment to the monarchy. But the cost was steep. Emotional distance became second nature. Vulnerability turned foreign. Her armor wasn't just metaphorical, it was instinct. Where Charles often buckled beneath public expectation, Anne seemed to grow stronger. But beneath that strength lived decades of unspoken pain. Pain that was never acknowledged, let alone addressed, because, in her world, to feel was to fail. And that's what made the courtroom moment so staggering. The woman who had never faltered, never wept, never once strayed from the rules, broke. Not loudly, not theatrically, but unmistakably. Her voice shook, her words cracked. And in that crack, the world finally glimpsed the girl behind the crown. Not the unflinching royal soldier, but the child who had spent her life carrying a burden that was never truly hers. The courtroom didn't just witness Anne's testimony, it witnessed her humanity. It wasn't a weakness, it was released. A release decades in the making. A release that didn't seek sympathy, but understanding. In that rare moment of vulnerability, Anne reminded everyone that strength isn't silence, it's survival. Her entire life had been a lesson in restraint. But now, with the Queen gone and the truth hanging in the balance, Anne chose to be more than a figure of duty. She chose to be a voice. And in doing so, she let the world see the sacrifice behind the service. But that steel was forged not just in silence, but in fire. And one terrifying night proved it forever. Faced with a loaded gun, Princess Anne didn't flinch. She simply said, "Not bloody likely." It was the night the monarchy nearly changed forever, March 20th, 1974. Princess Anne was returning from a charity event seated in the back of a royal car with her then-husband, Captain Mark Phillips. The streets of London were quiet until a lone vehicle forced the convoy to a sudden stop. What followed wasn't a political statement or a random act of violence. It was a meticulously planned kidnapping attempt by a man named Ian Ball, armed with a gun and driven by delusion. He had one goal, to snatch a royal, but what he didn't anticipate was the firestorm he'd encounter behind the royal car door. Ball approached with his weapon drawn, shouting, threatening, demanding Anne exit the vehicle. Security was overwhelmed, people were injured, but at the heart of the chaos, Princess Anne did the unthinkable. She stared him down. There was no panic, no surrender, no fear. It was one icy response that would define her for decades. Not bloody likely. It wasn't just defiance, it was defiance sharpened by instinct. At that moment, she didn't act like a princess. She acted like a soldier. She stalled. She challenged me. She refused to be controlled. And that refusal bought precious time that allowed bystanders and law enforcement to intervene. Shots rang out. A struggle ensued. But Anne survived, unshaken and uncaptured. When the dust settled, the headlines exploded. Not because a royal was attacked, but because a royal fought back. The public's perception of Anne shifted overnight. She was no longer just the Queen's daughter, a ceremonial figure attending public engagements in tailored coats. She was fierce, fearless. Humans. Her words became legend. Her stance became a symbol of strength. And without knowing it, Anne had drawn a line between herself and the myth of royal fragility. She wasn't there for the image. She was there for duty, and she'd fight to protect it. Decades later, in a courtroom filled with secrets and whispers, that same unshakable courage resurfaced. No bullets, no assailants, just the truth. And this time, Anne wasn't facing down a gun. She was facing down the entire weight of royal tradition. She knew what it meant to defy the system. She had done it before. And just like in 1974, she didn't blink. She stood tall, revealed private truths, and let the world see that bravery isn't always found on a battlefield. It's sometimes found in a whisper. Her courage that night on the streets of London was the foundation. But her courage in court? That was evolution. The world now understood that Anne's strength was no accident. It was earned, tested, and refined in fire. A strength she would now use to protect someone else, a woman rising quietly into her own spotlight. Because Anne's boldest words weren't spoken in defiance, they were spoken in faith. And it's that same courage Anne invoked again this time, to spotlight a woman who now carries the hopes of the monarchy. He was once just Kate. Now she's the crown's last best hope. For years, Catherine quietly played her role, graceful, polite, precisely measured in every appearance. She smiled when expected, stood beside William in silence when required, and never once hinted at ambition. The press loved her for her poise. The palace loved her for her predictability. But what no one realized was that beneath the layers of royal polish was a woman quietly learning how to lead not through power, but through presence. And now, with the monarchy at a crossroads, that patience has transformed her into something far greater than anyone expected its future. Anne's public endorsement was more than a passing comment. It was a signal, a passing of the moral scepter. By placing Catherine in the same breath as the Queen's private hopes, Anne wasn't just echoing tradition, she was rewriting it. Because Catherine is not the monarchy's heir by blood, but she is becoming its heir by purpose. Where the old guard ruled through distance and ceremony, Catherine connects through empathy and resilience. She visits hospitals, shelters, and schools, not for cameras, but for understanding. She speaks about mental health not as a slogan, but as a mission. And in every quiet act of compassion, she redefines what royalty can be. The palace has always been slow to change. Bound by centuries of custom and silence, it rarely allowed the people to see anything raw, anything real. But Catherine is different. She's not bound by the same scars of upbringing that shaped Anne or Charles. She wasn't raised to serve, she chose to. And that choice is what makes her powerful. Because while others wore the crown because they were born to, Catherine is proving she can carry it because she's earned it. Anne saw it. Long before the court heard her speak, she saw in Catherine's eyes the steadiness, the strength, the ability to endure without losing humanity. And when Anne stood in that courtroom, her words weren't merely reflective, they were strategic. She was shaping the path forward. In a monarchy that has long struggled between image and substance, Catherine is becoming both. And with that comes a rare opportunity, not just for stability, but for rebirth. Now, as the weight of tradition grows heavier on Charles, and as public trust wavers in the old structures, Catherine stands firm. Not loud, not flashy, but unshaken. She is the bridge between Elizabeth's legacy and William's reign, between Diana's dream and Anne's resolve, and perhaps most importantly, between a crown that once demanded obedience and a future that asks for authenticity. This message wasn't just a memory, it was a challenge to evolve, a challenge to choose leaders with heart. And in doing so, it wasn't Charles who was being dethroned. It was indifference, distance, and silence. What rose in its place was something rare, a monarchy that might finally feel human again. Princess Anne may never wear the crown, but her words may have just saved it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And we will see you in the next one.